Sales doesn't need to be hard or overcomplicated. That's not my way of saying that sales is easy. Rather, I'm saying that you can have a successful career in sales if you develop a process and execute on it consistently. This channel is dedicated to what a sales process framework could look like and showcasing the different best and worst practices around the different steps of a sales process. The intention is to publish short, weekly videos that are easily digestible with clear action items that you can begin doing today. Welcome to Sunday Sales Staples. Today's topic revolves around discovery calls. Discovery calls occur after you have done your homework on a prospect, sent your cold emails, made your cold calls, and the decision maker has finally agreed to an initial call to discuss your company's product, service, or solution. It's well known amongst sales professionals that discovery calls are where deals can be won or lost. This does not mean that you're going to be pitching your company and closing new business on these calls. Rather, the more you discover about your prospect, the more comprehensive your value story will be when presenting the proposal to your prospect. Since discovery calls are so important, I will be breaking down the subject into 3 videos. The first video will review the best and worst practices of discovery calls. The second video will cover the different questions that you can ask while on a discovery call. And the third video will cover one of the most important skills a salesperson needs, active listening. Once I have published the second and third videos, I will make sure to link them in the description below. And to start things off, let's jump into a story. A few years back, when I was an inside sales account executive at a startup, I was responsible for my own lead and pipeline generation. This, of course, meant endless hours of homework, cold emails, cold calls, leaving voicemails, getting hung up on, getting yelled at, etc. When I would finally get on the line with an interested decision maker, I would get overly excited and jump straight into a monologue about how great my company was and how we operated. My initial calls with these business owners and managers were all about me, and I gave the prospect very little time to talk about themselves. To no surprise, I wasn't generating the pipeline necessary to bring in my quota. Luckily, we had a new VP of sales join the organization shortly after me, and my desk was positioned right next to his. After a week of overhearing me on the phones, he asked me to take a walk outside on a Friday afternoon. To be honest, the invite startled me a little bit, and my mind started racing. Oh no, a walk on a Friday afternoon is never a good sign. What did the VP want to talk about? What was I doing wrong? Did he not like me? This sort of negative self-talk is destructive in sales, and I advise everyone to steer clear of it. When Friday afternoon came around, my VP and I actually had a very pleasant walk and talk. The VP was quick to identify my weakness on my discovery calls and suggested a few resources on improving how I conduct them. That weekend, I spent a few hours researching the suggested materials, and it opened my eyes to a completely new way of doing things. After I implemented some of the things that I learned from the resources, I crafted a totally new process for my discovery calls. Within 3 months, my sales velocity drastically changed. Pipeline generation increased, average deal length decreased, and my win rates increased, all because I was starting my opportunities off on the right foot with my new discovery call framework. Here are some of the best practices that I was able to pull from these resources and that you can begin using today. The first best practice, and the one I need everyone to remember whenever I train them on discovery calls, is that this is your chance to ask questions on questions on questions. No, I don't mean you should play 20 questions with your prospects, but you should have a list of questions to uncover the prospect's current workflow, their pain points, how they implement changes, who is involved in the decision-making process at the company, and how they measure the success of any change that they implement. All of this information will help you uncover the full value proposition of your product, which you'll then be able to take to bridge the gap between your prospect's current state and a future state when it comes time to give them a proposal. As you're asking your prospects questions, you should remember that nearly everyone's favorite topic is themselves, their hobbies, their interests, problems, etc. If you can get someone to talk about themselves, then you will begin to hear what motivates them and how your solution can bring value to their position at their company. Do your best to keep your prospect talking about themselves, their roles, their goals, and their pain points, as it only strengthens your service. And while your prospects are answering your questions, you need to make sure that you're actively listening. This means giving them your full attention and listening to understand, not to reply. Active listening is a subject that bears its own video, and once I release my active listening video, I will link it in the description below. Another thing to do when you're actively listening and your prospect is answering your questions is to take notes. As you seek to understand their current state versus their desired future state, you need to jot down what is most valuable to your prospects. You will then be able to take these notes and craft a comprehensive story as to why they should implement your product, service, or solution during a proposal. Don't rely on your memory alone to remember talking points. Either jot them down or revisit the call if your company has invested in a conversational intelligence tool like Gong or Chorus. And the last best practice that I recommend during discovery calls is to assign homework to your prospect. After you get off the phone with your prospect, they will likely still be on your mind, and you'll go into your CRM to update it, maybe start to build a proposal. However, your prospect will quickly go back to their day-to-day and move on with the various tasks that require their attention. Instead of having the prospect only engage with you on calls and meetings, assign them a small homework assignment to keep your product top of mind when you're not on the phone with them. And now that we've covered some of my top best practices for discovery calls, let's jump into some of the worst practices. The first worst practice is to not set an agenda. At the beginning of the call, you shouldn't just jump into your line of questions. Rather, set the tone for the call by stating the agenda, which could be something like, today's call is centered around you, and the goal is to uncover enough information to see if my solution makes sense for your company. I will be asking a few questions about your current process. I will give you a brief overview of why our company exists, and then we will agree on next steps. If you have any questions throughout the call, please don't hesitate to ask. Setting an agenda not only makes you look like an organized sales professional, it lets your prospect know that there's a purpose for this call. The next worst practice is to ask close-ended questions. This means asking yes/no questions that don't move the conversation anywhere. Close-ended questions sound like, have you ever experienced this pain? Has anyone ever tried to fix this problem? And have you ever considered our product in the past? These sorts of questions leave your prospect with an easy out to say as little as possible. Instead of close-ended questions, you should focus on open-ended questions. I will be compiling a list of open-ended questions and releasing a separate video with examples. Once it's released, I'll make sure to link it in the description below so that you can review. And like I mentioned earlier, the discovery call is all about the prospect. If you spend too much time talking versus listening, then your prospect is bound to get bored and lose interest. A healthy talk time percentage for a discovery call should be between 20 and 40% of that call. The other 60 to 80% of the call should be filled by the prospect answering your questions. When a salesperson is talking 60 to 80% of a discovery call, it generally means that they're already pitching the prospect on their product, which is another worst practice. A prospect may say something like, our current vendor's invoicing system doesn't work properly, and a salesperson will quickly jump in to say, well, our invoicing system has a 99.5% accuracy rate, which means that by switching to our platform, you will no longer have these issues. This is a terrible approach. It shows that you're listening to respond, not to understand. Rather than jump into how you'll solve their issue, take note of it and save the value prop for your proposal. Now, if a prospect asks you specifically how your invoicing system works, then of course you can answer them, but you shouldn't pitch the product too heavily on this initial call. And a lot of times when people are pitching their product on discovery calls, they may end up interrupting their prospect. A prospect may say something like, our current vendor's invoicing system doesn't work properly, and the salesperson jumps in to pitch the solution to this problem. But had the sales rep let the prospect finish, they would have heard the prospect say, our current vendor's invoicing system doesn't work properly, which has led to a 20% increase in overdue invoices. By not interrupting, the sales professional extracts the full story behind why a prospect would implement their solution. Also, it's just plain rude to interrupt others while they're talking. I'm sure you don't like it when people interrupt you, so please don't make this mistake while conducting your discoveries. That wraps up this week's overview of discovery calls, and I appreciate you checking out the video. If you want to dig deeper into discovery calls, I highly recommend checking out some articles that you can easily find on Google. Some people will have similar ideas to mine, and others will differ. At the end of the day, it's up to you to craft your own discovery call strategy, but I do hope there were some key takeaways that you can begin using today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, sales does not need to be hard. While sales is becoming vastly more complex with metrics and data, your process does not need to be so convoluted that it isn't easily replicated. Keep coming back to the channel to learn more about how to simplify your process and win new business. And feel free to email me at sundaysalestaples@gmail.com or reach out on Instagram at sundaysalestaples. Thanks again for stopping by, and I'll catch you next week.